So the Golden State Killer, when I initially ran across that in 1994, was known as the East Area Rapist. And as I started digging into the series of unsolved rapes, I started recognizing that, oh, this is a big case. There's over 50 attacks in Northern California. And DNA technology was just starting to get into law enforcement laboratories, and I was in training to do DNA. So I wonder if I can use this newfangled DNA technology in order to solve this unsolved East Area Rapist case. And East Area Rapist was attacking up in Sacramento, starting in Sacramento in 1976, and then started to branch out in Northern California, and then disappeared out in Northern California in 1979. In 2001, I ended up using a newer DNA technology that linked this unsolved East Area Rapist series to an unsolved series of homicides in Southern California, which is known as the original Night Stalker. And eventually, over the course of 20 years, the DNA technology finally caught up to where myself and other members of law enforcement utilized the genetic genealogy tool for the very first time and solved what was now known as the Golden State Killer case, identifying Joseph DeAngelo, a former cop, as being the East Area Rapist, as being the original Night Stalker, or now he's known as the Golden State Killer.
So it must resonate with you that 24 years working that case, there's a lot of investigators on this Warren Forrest investigation who have come out of retirement, who've been working the case. We talked about Doug Mass.
Yeah.
He was one of the first detectives on the Lacamas Lake victim, which is a pseudonym we call her because she does not want her identity revealed. But now that you know more about the case, what does that mean to you, knowing that these investigators kind of have the same creed that you do of not giving up?
Well, I think that's what, for those of us that are in the profession, and I think about Doug, he's out at a scene, and he's seeing what has happened to that victim. There's an attachment as a human that you get for what this other person experienced. And for me, for the one case we just talked about with the Golden State Killer, initially, I had never met any of the victims or the victims' families of the homicide victims. But once I did, instead of it being like, oh, I'd be interested to solve this case, it now became an obligation and then obviously an obsession. And I think for those investigators with the sheriff's office here, you're looking, at autopsy photos and crime scene photos, and you're reading about the findings, and you start thinking about the horrific things that these victims went through. And, obviously some didn't survive and some did. And so it shows that there's a level, it's compassion and passion. And that's where I'm so impressed that somebody like Doug Mass, 1974, he's on this case. Mm-hmm. And then over the years, over the decades, he keeps coming back to this case. And that is what an investigator should do, an investigator that cares.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. So obviously that was one of the reasons why I reached out to you a couple years ago now. And it was...
Has it been that long?
It feels like, at least a year.
Wow.
And I feel like from the get-go, you were like, how can I help? And is that, now that you've retired from is it
Contra Costa County.
Okay, right. I always have a hard time saying that.
Yeah.
Talk about the work that you're doing now with Othram and how you're utilizing your skills to stay in the game, basically, right?
Sure. Well, ever since I retired in 2018, I have been consulting with law enforcement, and I had a relationship with the founder of Othram, Dave Middleman, since 2018, when he called me up and said, I know what you did in Golden State Killer, and I can do it better, because he comes out of the medical field where they were utilizing the tools in order to do that type of DNA analysis. And so
what does that mean for the layperson? How could he do it better being in the medical profession?
Well, in essence, he was familiar with the hardware, with the software that is used in order to generate the type of DNA profile that is needed in order to do the genealogy. And he recognized that with his expertise, he could create a laboratory, a purpose-built laboratory to do genealogy. For Golden State Killer, we ended up using a genealogy laboratory that wasn't based on forensic evidence. It was based on the commercial genealogy test kits, right? And so their technology really is not adapted to forensic samples, where you have a little bit of sample and it's highly degraded or it's mixed. This is the real world. And so Dave Middleman ended up founding Othram, and he was true to his word. And so over the course of about 5 years, I was watching what his company was doing, and then eventually he and I got talking, and I decided, yeah, you know what, I'd like to work as an investigator for Othram, where I'm doing like what I'm doing here with Clark County, is I can consult on the case, and I am holistic. It's all aspects, the forensic, the investigative, the behavioral aspects of the case that I bring to the table when I'm talking to law enforcement. But I'm also helping guide them to find samples that potentially could help solve the case using Othram's technology.
So in your 30 years as an investigator, describe what you did, because you have this huge umbrella of you helped solve the Golden State Killer case, but you're a criminalist. That's what you started as, right? So kind of walk us through what your role is in other cases and how that could be effective for Clark County.
Well, I think that's my career and the various positions I held during the course of my career gives me a breadth of expertise that most, let's say, detectives never get exposed to, because I worked in a forensic laboratory for much of the early part of my career, and I worked in toxicology, serology, ABO testing, and then ultimately DNA. I did work in firearms and latents. I was a CSI, and during this time I was also getting passionate about pursuing cold cases and serial predator cases. And so over the course of time I developed a level of expertise in how to approach those types of cases, utilizing my forensic background and scientific background. And while I was doing that, then I'm starting to recognize how to investigate those types of cases. And I just became fascinated with the psychology of the serial predator. So I studied the behavioral aspects. So when I sit down with Clark County and talk to them about the case, I am looking at the entire spectrum of what's going on in the case to help give them some, let's say, fresh eyes. And I've already met with them multiple times, and I'm so impressed. I mean, you think Doug Mass is, he's been around for a long time, and he knows what he's doing. He's got a lot of experience. And then, Fred Neiman, you could tell that they really want to solve the case, and they have done a great job investigating the case, as well as interfacing with their forensic scientists. But I can kind of come in and say, oh, you know what, I see something here. Or guess what we can do at Othram.
When you think about your legacy, I mean, that's kind of a big deal, right?
Yeah, this was, with Golden State Killer, I didn't recognize what impact utilizing that technology for the first time was going to have on law enforcement and on these unsolved cases. And so it really was, me and my team, and this includes, Steve Kramer from the FBI, Barbara Ray Venter, Kirk Campbell, and Monica Tchaikovsky from SAC DA's office. This small group of individuals utilizing this technology for the first time has revolutionized law enforcement's ability to solve cases like this.
And was it because you were so hyper-focused on this particular case that you weren't thinking kind of global, like this could be something huge? You were just like, this is huge.
It was one of those things where I didn't invent this technology. Barbara Ray Venter was the one that showed us how it was done. It was a technology that was being used for adoptees to identify their biological parents. And I just, because of association with another homicide, I found out about what Barbara was doing, and I called her up. And then I just recognized, because of my past as being a DNA analyst, once I learned how this was done, I recognized its power.
That's a really good point, because of your forensic background. As you're not necessarily a detective.
I kind of wore both hats.
Yeah, and so you were the bridge to see, because a lot of times now after the Golden State Killer, you still had, my perspective is, being, true crime podcast host / journalist, is that you either have investigators who have these cold cases who heard of Paul Holes and the Golden State Killer, and they're like, okay, can we do this with our case, right? Or, you still have investigators who need to be convinced, like, wait, what? Investigative genetic genealogy? Isn't that what my grandma does to find lost relatives? And now it's like, you don't have to convince anyone anymore. This works.
Yeah.
It's
proven. I mean, we are now 7 years post arrest of D'Angelo, Golden State Killer, and when you start talking about criminal cases, hundreds upon hundreds of criminal cases have been solved utilizing this technology. But even goes further than that, is that you have all of these unidentified bodies that are found across the nation, these Jane and John Does. This tool is identifying, I think, well over 1,000, and getting that person back to their family. So it's just, it really just kind of exploded. And that's where, I was so focused on just solving GSK. It wasn't until afterwards when I sat down with my counterpart, who was Sergeant Ken Clark from SAC Homicide, who was part of the GSK task force. And we're having drinks, and he says, Paul, this is going to revolutionize things. And that was the first time I just was, what? And he goes, this is the next big revolution in law enforcement. He recognized that before I did, but he also, talking to him, he reckoned, he goes, I wouldn't have thought of this, in terms of how to pursue something like this, because of the science that most investigators don't have.
Yeah.
And so that's just where I'm this weird hybrid. That's where I will, it was a team effort, but I pat myself on the back because I was able to recognize this is how this case is going to get solved.
Mm-hmm. So do you know, and I'm just curious, do you know a lot about Martha Morrison and how she was identified and that throughout that entire process? I
have an understanding.
It was pretty incredible,
right.
Like how, they had lost the bones, they lost the human remains.
Well, I didn't know that.
Okay.
So my understanding of Martha's case is she was found. And she's skeletal.
Yeah.
No way to identify her back in 1974, I believe it was.
Yeah.
So, but because of she was the one that the family never reported missing, or has that been?
She was from Eugene, Oregon, and she told her brother that she was going to Portland. She's going to take a trip up here, and that was kind of the last they heard of her. And so her brother lived in Alaska. And so, he had been told through the family grapevine that their father they didn't share the same father, but Martha's father had filed a missing persons report. And so he didn't really know, they all kind of didn't really know what to do or what more they should do. So probably 15 years after she went missing, his wife happened to be talking to a detective in Alaska who was like, okay, I can help you. We're going to put submit your DNA to NamUs.
Yep.
And we're going to, you need to contact the Eugene police. And when he contacted the Eugene police, they had said, we have nothing on record for her because there was a flood. And if he did file something, it probably got washed away in this flood. Yeah. So those two things had to happen because Clark County had been searching missing persons, looking for girls that had gone missing, and there was nothing there, right?
Well, and this is where, because this took until 2010, if I remember right, for her to finally be identified.
She was finally identified because they ended up having to exhume the father, and so a lot of moving parts to it, a lot of NamUs funded that. That's that's really expensive, and they finally identified her in 2015 because it was weird back then. Even though the brother was a half brother, and so it directed once they uploaded her DNA once they found the remains. First of all, they uploaded them into NamUs, and then it connected to the brother. He was a half brother, so it brought them to the family tree. And then for whatever reason, the sister wasn't enough at that time to 100% say, yes, this is Martha Morrison. It's another family member, but it's not enough. And then the mother who had passed away, they went and found tissue samples and they were degraded too much. So again, it confirmed that she was a part of the family. The ultimate thing was to exhume the father's remains. And then it was 100%.
Right. Well, and people don't understand, even though you have siblings that, share DNA amongst themselves that they inherited from their parents. When you're doing the traditional STR type testing that law enforcement does, that type of sibling analysis sometimes can be kind of tough to determine. Was this really a sibling of our victim or not?
Even if they are siblings?
Even if they are true siblings. And when you start talking about a half brother, I'm kind of surprised that with a half brother that focused in the right direction.
It did.
That's pretty far.